Hi everyone, it's Miss Peggy yet again with chapter 14 of The Magician's Nephew. And I know you probably remember the last words of chapter 13 where finally Fledge, with Diggory and Polly on his back, had landed back in Narnia, and Diggory slid off and walked up to Aslan and said, "I brought you the apple you wanted, sir." And that's where we left chapter 13. Now let's begin chapter 14, the planting of the tree. "Well done," said Aslan in a voice that made the earth shake. Then Diggory knew that all the Narnians had heard those voices and that the story of them would be handed down from father to son in that new world for hundreds of years and perhaps forever. But he was in no danger of feeling conceited, for he didn't think about it at all now that he was face to face with Aslan. "Well done, son of Adam," said the lion again. "For this fruit you have hungered and thirsted, and you have wept. No hand but yours shall sow the seed of the tree that will be the protection of Narnia. Throw the apple toward the river bank, where the ground is soft." Diggory did what he was told. Everyone had grown so quiet that you could hear the soft thump where it fell into the mud. "It is well thrown," said Aslan. "Let us now proceed to the coronation of King Frank of Narnia and Helen, his queen." The children now noticed those two for the first time. They were dressed in strange and beautiful clothes, and from their shoulders rich robes flowed out behind them to where the 4 dwarfs held up the king's train and 4 river nymphs held the queen's train. Their heads were bare, but Helen had let her hair down, and it made a great improvement in her appearance. But it was neither hair nor clothes that made them look so different from their own old selves. Their faces had a new expression, especially the king. All the sharpness and cunning and quarrelsomeness which he had picked up as a London cabby seemed to have been washed away, and the courage and kindness which he'd always had were easier to see. Perhaps it was the air of that young world that had done it, or talking with Aslan, or both. "'Pon my word," whispered Fledge to Polly, "my old master's been changed nearly as much as I have. Why, he's a real master now." "Yes, but don't buzz in my ear like that," said Polly. "It tickles." "Now," said Aslan, "some of you undo that tangle you have made with those trees, and let us see what we shall find there." Diggory now saw that where 4 trees grew close together, their branches had been all laced together or tied together so as to make a sort of cage. The 2 elephants with their trunks and a few dwarfs with their little axes soon got it all undone. There were 3 things inside the cage. Here's a picture of the cage. There were 3 things inside the cage. One was a young tree that seemed to be made out of gold. The second was a young tree that seemed to be made out of silver. But the third was a miserable object in muddy clothes, sitting hunched up between them. "Phew," whispered Diggory. "Uncle Andrew!" To explain all this, we must go back a bit. The beasts, you remembered, had tried planting and watering him. When the watering him brought him to his senses, he found himself soaking wet, buried up to his thighs in the earth, which was quickly turning to mud, and surrounded by more wild animals than he had ever dreamed of in his life before. It's perhaps not surprising that he began to scream and howl. This, in a way, was a good thing, for at last it persuaded everyone, even the warthog, that he was alive. So they dug him up again. His trousers really were in a shocking state by now. As soon as his legs were free, he tried to bolt, but one swift curl of the elephant's trunk around his waist soon put an end to that. Everyone now thought he must be kept safe somewhere, and so they made a sort of cage all around him. And then they offered him everything they could think of to eat. The donkey collected great piles of thistles and threw them in, but Uncle Andrew didn't seem to care for them. The squirrels bombarded him with nuts, but he only covered his head with his hands and tried to keep out of the way. Several birds flew to and fro, diligently dropping worms upon him. The bear was especially kind. During the afternoon, he found a wild bee's nest, and instead of eating it himself, which he very much would have liked to have done, this worthy creature brought it back to Uncle Andrew. But in fact, this was the worst failure of all. The bear lobbed the whole sticky mess over the top of the enclosure, and unfortunately it hit Uncle Andrew slap in the face. And not all the bees were dead. The bear, who would not have minded at all being hit in the face with a beehive and a honeycomb, could not understand why Uncle Andrew staggered back, slipped, and sat down. And it was sheer bad luck that he sat down on the pile of thistles. And anyway, as the warthog said, quite a lot of honey has gotten into the creature's mouth, and that's bound to have done him some good. They were quite fond of their strange pet, and they hoped that Aslan would allow them to keep it. The cleverer ones were quite sure by now that at least some of the noises that were coming out of his mouth had meaning, and so they gave him the name of Brandy because that seemed to be the noise he made most often. In the end, however, they had to leave him there for the night. Aslan had been busy all that day, instructing the new queen and king and doing other important things, and they couldn't attend to poor old Brandy. So what with the nuts and pears and apples and bananas that had been thrown into him, he did fairly well for supper, but it wouldn't be true to say that he passed an agreeable night. "Bring out that creature," said Aslan, and one of the elephants lifted Uncle Andrew in his trunk and laid him at the lion's feet. He was too frightened to move. "Please, Aslan," said Polly, "could you say something to unfrighten him? And then could you say something to prevent him from ever coming back here again?" "Do you think he wants to?" said Aslan. "Well, Aslan, he might send someone else. He's so excited about that bar off the lamppost growing into a lamppost tree, and he thinks great folly, child," said Aslan. "This world is bursting with life for these few days because the song which I sang called it into life, and that still hangs in the air and rumbles in the ground. It will not be so for long. But I can't tell this to the old sinner, and I cannot comfort him either. He has made himself unable to hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would only hear growlings and roarings. Oh, Adam's sons, how cleverly you defend yourself against all that might do you good. But I will give him the only gift that he is still able to receive." He bowed his great head rather sadly and breathed into the magician's terrified face. "Sleep," he said. "Sleep and be separated for some few hours from all the torments you have devised for yourself." And Uncle Andrew immediately rolled over with closed eyes and began breathing peacefully. "Carry him aside and lay him down," said Aslan. "Now, dwarfs, show your smithcraft. I want you to make me 2 crowns for your king and your queen." More dwarfs than you could dream of rushed forward to the golden tree. They had all its leaves stripped off and some of its branches torn off too, before you could say Jack Robinson. And now the children could see that it didn't merely look gold, but it really was soft yellow gold. It had, of course, sprung up from the half-sovereigns, which had fallen out of Uncle Andrew's pocket when he was turned upside down, just as the silver had grown up from the half-crowns. From nowhere, as it seemed, piles of dry brushwood from fuel, a little anvil, hammers, tongs, and bellows were produced. And the next moment, how those dwarfs loved their work. The fire was blazing, the bellows were roaring, the gold was melting, the hammers were clinking. 2 moles, whom Aslan had sent to dig, which is what they liked to do best, earlier in the day, poured out a pile of precious stones at the dwarfs' feet. Here are the dwarfs with their anvil, and they're making gold crowns for Queen Helen and King Frank. Under the clever fingers of the little smiths, two crowns took shape. Not ugly, heavy things like modern crowns, but light, delicate, beautifully shaped circles you could easily wear and look nicer by wearing. The king's was set with rubies, and the queen's with emeralds. When the crowns had been cooled in the river, Aslan made Frank and Helen kneel before him, and he placed the crowns on their heads. And then he said, "Rise up, King and Queen of Narnia, father and mother of many kings that shall be in Narnia and the Isles and in Archenland. Be just and merciful and brave. The blessing is upon you." Then everyone cheered or bayed or neighed or trumpeted or clapped its wings, and the royal pair stood looking very solemn and a little bit shy, but all the nobler for their shyness. And while Diggory was still cheering, he heard the deep voice of Aslan behind him, saying, "Look." Everyone in that crowd turned its head, and then everyone drew a long breath of wonder and delight. A little way off, towering above their heads, they saw a tree which had certainly not been there before. It must have grown up silently, yet swiftly, like a flag rises up when you pull it on the flagpole, and while they were all busied about at the coronation. Its spreading branches seemed to cast light rather than shade, and silver apples peeped out like stars from under every leaf. Here's a beautiful picture of King Frank and Queen Helen and Aslan. And back behind them, I guess, is that beautiful tree. But it was the smell which came from it, even more than the sight, that had made everyone draw their breath. For a moment, one could hardly think of anything else. "Son of Adam," said Aslan, "you have sown well. And you Narnians, let it be your first care to guard this tree, for it is your shield. The witch, of whom I have told you, has fled far away to the north. She will live on there, growing stronger in dark magic. But while that tree flourishes, she will never come down into Narnia. She dare not come within 100 miles of that tree. For its smell, which is joy and life and health to you, is death and horror and despair to her." Everyone stared solemnly at the tree, when Aslan suddenly swung around his head, scattering golden gleams of light from his mane as he did so, and he fixed his large eyes on the children. "What is it, children?" he said, for he caught them in the very act of whispering and nudging one another. "Oh, Aslan, sir," Diggory said, turning red, "I forgot to tell you. The witch has already eaten one of those apples, one of the same that the tree grew from." He hadn't really said all he was thinking, but Polly at once said it for him. "The smell of the apple." "Why do you think that, daughter of Eve?" asked the lion. "Well, she ate one." "Child," he replied, "that is why all the rest are now a horror to her. That is what happens to those who pluck and eat fruits at the wrong time and in the wrong way. The fruit is good, but they loathe it forever." "Oh, I see," said Polly. "And I suppose because she took it in the wrong way, it won't work for her. I mean, it won't make her always young and all that." "Alas," said Aslan, shaking his head, "it will. Things always work according to their nature. She has won her heart's desire, her unwearying strength, and endless days like a goddess. But length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery, and already she begins to know it. All things get what they want, but they don't always like it." I nearly ate one myself, Aslan," said Diggory. "Would I?" "You would, child," said Aslan, "for the fruit always works. It must work, but it does not work happily for those who pluck it at their own will. If any Narnian, unbidden, had stolen an apple and planted it here to protect Narnia, it would have protected Narnia. But it would have done so by making Narnia into another strong and cruel empire like Charn, not the kindly land I mean it to be. And the witch tempted you to do another thing, my son, did she not? Yes, lad, Aslan. She wanted me to take an apple home to my mother. Understand, then, that it would have healed her, but not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said that it would have been better to die in that illness. At that, Diggory could say nothing, for tears choked him, and he gave up all hope of saving his mother's life. But at the same time, he knew what would have happened, and that there might be things even more terrible than losing someone you love by death. But now Aslan was speaking again, almost in a whisper. That is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple, but it is not what will happen now. What I give you now will bring joy. It will not, in your world, give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree. For a second, Diggory could hardly understand. It was as if the whole world had turned inside out and upside down. And then, like someone in a dream, he walked across to the tree, and the king and queen were cheering him, and all the creatures were cheering too. He picked the apple and put it in his pocket, and then he came back to Aslan. Please, he said, may I go home now? He had forgotten to say thank you, but he meant it, and Aslan understood. And that's the end of chapter 14. We'll go to the very last chapter of the book, number 15, next time I see you, and I hope that'll be soon. Bye for now.